Thank you everyone for being here today and expressing interest in this project. We've had quite a bit of interest, and that's why we've decided to hold this public information meeting. Really, the intent of this meeting is to clarify kind of what we're proposing and the actual changes. We're kind of going to compare the existing regulations to what we're proposing. Yeah, and just kind of go over it in further detail and provide staff rationale for the changes. And at the very end, we'll kind of provide an opportunity to have some discussion and answer questions you might have. So just to provide a bit of an outline of what we're going to talk about, part one, I'll just provide kind of the purpose of these amendments at a very high level. Then we'll get into the actual changes themselves. So I've divided up into two different parts, the kind of agricultural changes and the other kind of housekeeping changes we're proposing. Part four, we'll go over some next steps. So what exactly is going to happen after this meeting. And then we'll end with the kind of discussion and, open it up for public input. So purpose, again, the purpose of this actual meeting is more to provide clarification. It's kind of an additional opportunity for public consultation. So like Kim mentioned, there will be that more formal opportunity to provide input as part of the public hearing process, which will happen at a later date. So the purpose of these amendments, largely the purpose is actually to do with some changes that were made to the Agricultural Land Commission Act and Use Regulation. So a lot of these changes are actually related specifically to agricultural land. So the Agricultural Land Commission, if you don't know, is a provincial body that oversees farmland in BC. So they have their own kind of zoning or land use designation for farmland, which is called the Agricultural Land Reserve. So when we're talking about ALR land or agricultural land reserve, that's what we're talking about. The other changes largely are intended to clarify existing areas of the bylaw. There's a lot of areas in the bylaw that have kind of caused some confusion. And a lot of our intent with this is actually to kind of make it more clear. And then the third kind of reason is we have some specific areas where we actually are looking to update parts of the bylaw. So that's mostly to do with height. We are looking to put in some height regulations for specific zones and specific uses. So yeah, that's kind of the intent. Largely, it is intended to be to update the bylaw to be in line with the changes that the ALC has made. And then the housekeeping stuff is kind of secondary to that. So just an overview of the agricultural changes. There's four kind of main changes that are being proposed. So the secondary farm residence, temporary farm worker housing, agricultural cannabis production, and cannabis retail. So I'll go through each of those topics in more detail. So the first one is secondary farm residence. So we have this existing term in our bylaw called farm employee residence. Basically, the ALC, or the Agricultural Land Commission, has decided to allow for an additional residence, specifically on ALR land. So that land that's designated provincially as farmland. So what we're trying to do by making these changes is to kind of align our bylaw with these changes. So right now, this requires an application to the SLRD. But it's specifically called farm employee residence. So what we're proposing is to change the terminology to secondary farm residence. So that's kind of recognizing that it no longer has to be specifically for employees. And we'll replace the definition in our bylaw. So we won't refer to farm employee residence anymore. So again, if we're looking at the existing regulations or kind of how it was done, it was an SLRD application, but it was also an application to the Agricultural Land Commission. So the Agricultural Land Commission has already removed that application, and they've provided some specific criteria of when an additional residence is permitted on farmland without requiring an application. So what we're looking to do is keep these conditions in our bylaw. So you'll see them here, the proposed changes. This is essentially what we would have required in an SLRD application. So before we would have required an actual covenant, we're removing the requirement for that covenant. So now the requirements would be that the property has to have farm status. The property has to be 4 hectares or greater. If there's an existing kind of main farm residence on the property, it has to be 500 square meters or less. And the maximum size for this secondary farm residence would be 90 square meters on parcels 40 hectares or less, or 186 square meters on parcels over that 40 hectares. So that's not to say that somebody couldn't potentially have something that doesn't meet all of those requirements. It would just be required to go through what the ALC is calling a non-adhering residential use application. So say you have a residence on your property that's over that 500 square meters, or you're proposing a second residence that's over the amount that you're permitted, you would just need to go through this application. But if you meet all of those requirements, it means that you won't need an application anymore. You would, of course, still need a building permit application, but you just wouldn't have that additional application. So just to kind of summarize these changes, under the existing regulations, this is a SLRD application and an ALC application. So with the proposed changes, there would be no application. And the terminology is changing from farm employee residence to secondary farm residence to kind of clarify that you're no longer required to have this used for farm employees. So yeah, the intent really there is just to align it with what the ALC changes are. So the next area is temporary farm worker housing. So under existing regulations, this was an SLRD application. So there was quite a few requirements for this application. One of which was a statutory declaration. So you would have to let the SLRD know on an annual basis that the residence was still being used for farm employees. And it was usually there's kind of a time period because it was meant to be a temporary use. And then there was also a covenant essentially saying the same thing, that the housing had to be used for farm employees on a temporary basis. So the proposed changes here are really to align with ALC changes again. So the ALC now is taking over this application. This is done through a non-adhering residential use application with the ALC. So the SLRD is actually reducing our requirements. We're no longer requiring an application because the ALC is essentially requiring the same things that we required under our application. So you'll see on the screen here, it's similar to what's required for the secondary farm residence, but there's the additional covenant and an irrevocable letter of credit. So it's just ensuring that there's some money kind of put aside in case they ever have to remove that structure or building. And then they have some stipulations around siding and the housing type. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I would suggest you look at ALC policy L26. They have kind of further details on their criteria for that application. So yeah, this is just kind of to explain further the changes that we're proposing to our actual bylaw. So we would essentially have these changes here, the ALC requirements, we would list those in our bylaw just to reflect what the ALC is doing. And then we would also propose to maintain the following conditions that we've already set out in our bylaw. So meeting standards like the BC Public Health Act, the BC Building Code, and guidelines for the provision of seasonal housing for migrant farm workers in BC. A geotechnical report, so if there's housing proposed in the floodplain, we would look for a geotechnical report to determine the flood construction level. Siding would need to be within the farm residential footprint area. And we would still want to see that statutory declaration on an annual basis. Just to kind of emphasize, these are already requirements under our existing bylaw. So we're just looking to maintain these, and these would be something that we look at the building permit stage. So again, just to kind of summarize here, this is basically just going from an SLRD application to an ALC application. And we're looking to kind of maintain some of our requirements that we already have under our existing application. So the next topic area is agricultural cannabis production. So under our existing bylaw, we have this use of cannabis production facility. So this is defined in our existing bylaw as kind of the industrial style cannabis production. So, you know, like an industrial kind of building. So the ALC now is considering agricultural cannabis production to be a farm use. They're kind of distinguishing that from cannabis production facilities. So that would be crops grown crops grown outside in a field or inside, you know, like with a structure that still has a base made of soil. So that would be considered agricultural cannabis production, and that is a farm use. So we as a local government actually can't prohibit or regulate that use anymore. So what we're proposing here is to distinguish between those two different types of cannabis production. And we're proposing to add agricultural cannabis production as a permitted use in the agricultural zone. So again, just to kind of show visually here what we're actually proposing. So we'd be going from just having that cannabis production facility use to having the cannabis production facility use and this new agricultural cannabis production use. So the next topic area for the agricultural changes is cannabis retail. So under our existing regulations, cannabis retail is explicitly excluded from the definition of farm retail sales. The province, I think in October, just created this new licensing called, I think, producer retail sales license. So somebody that has a federally, what is it called? Like a federal production license for cannabis would be able to apply for this new license to also sell on the same property. So basically what we're doing here is trying to change the regulations just so we don't prohibit that. Because yeah, cannabis production is permitted as a form of farm gate retail sales now. So it would be subject to that provincial licensing and of course the ALC regulations as well. So again, just to summarize, under the existing regulations, cannabis retail is specifically prohibited as a form of farm retail sales. So we're just looking to allow that as a type of retail or farm retail sales. So moving on to the housekeeping changes. So we have 4 kind of key areas here to discuss. So the main ones are gross floor area calculations, height regulations, camping definitions, and then there's some kind of other more minor changes. So looking at the gross floor area calculations kind of broadly, there's been a lot of, I think, confusion around how we calculate gross floor area. And it's not super clear in our existing bylaw what is included and excluded for different types of buildings and different uses. So what we're proposing kind of two changes. So we would update our existing definition of gross floor area to specify that buildings are actually calculated on, or sorry, gross floor area is calculated on a per building basis rather than per lot. And then the second kind of change would be to separate gross floor area calculations. So right now we just have this kind of general gross floor area calculation that we only apply to principal buildings. But what we're proposing here is to actually provide a specific list of exclusions also for accessory buildings, carriage houses, and cottages. So I just want to kind of compare for each one how we currently calculate gross floor area for that specific type of building. And then I'll show what we're proposing as the actual changes. So this is the existing calculation of gross floor area. This is listed under the general regulations, but it actually only applies to principal buildings. So there has been some confusion around that, but that was the intent with that regulation. So I just want to show what the actual changes are. So everything highlighted there is what we're actually proposing to change. So it's basically, the intent here really is to kind of differentiate between all the different types of, like unenclosed and enclosed patios and balconies and things like that, whether at grade or not at grade, and attached or unattached. So just to show like when we would actually include that and when we would exclude it. So we're trying to be really specific here so there's no confusion. And I want to also highlight here that we're actually increasing the exclusion for unenclosed balconies, verandas, porches, or decks. It used to be only 10% that we would exclude. We've increased it to 20%. And then we're also adding an exclusion for rooftop patios. So just to show like kind of a summary here, really what we're doing is creating more lenient regulations here. So right now the regulations read that you can only exclude unenclosed balconies, decks, things like that up to 10%. So we're actually increasing that to 20%. So yeah, that's the main kind of change there. And then the other kind of reason, the rationale is we're getting a lot of confusion around the different types of patios and, if it's at grade or whether it's attached, like how we would look at that in terms of gross floor area. So the other thing we're trying to do here is really clarify, for patios at grade, how we would calculate that. And then again, we've added rooftop patios as an exclusion. So yeah, we're just trying to kind of look at all the different scenarios of, balconies and patios and things like that. And we really are trying to make this less restrictive. So moving on to the gross floor area calculation for accessory buildings. So there's a couple of things to note here. The first one is that while an accessory building is considered a carriage house, carriage houses are excluded from this because they have their own regulations related to gross floor area. So I'll go over that, but our bylaw does actually specifically state that carriage houses are excluded from this. So this is a table taken from the existing bylaw. This is the only regulation we have under our current bylaw that calculates gross floor area. We don't have any exclusions or specific inclusions. There's no list like that. So really with accessory buildings, we're counting everything in that gross floor area. So that's what I'm kind of trying to get across here. There were really no exclusions for accessory buildings. So what we're proposing is this new list of inclusions and exclusions for accessory buildings, again, excluding carriage houses because they'll have their own. So really a accessory building would include everything except crawl spaces, unenclosed patios at grade where unattached to a building or structure. This is kind of a given, but it is considered landscaping when it's a patio at grade that's unattached, but we just want to put that in there to make that very clear. And then rooftop patios and attics would also be excluded. So these are basically the exclusions that would just be for every building. Again, they will each have their own gross floor area calculation, but those are just kind of exclusions that make sense for every building. So again, just to summarize, under the existing regulations, accessory buildings don't have a real calculation or list of inclusions and exclusions because they had this density and maximum size that was established through that table. So there was really, we didn't feel there was a need to kind of specify through that list of inclusions and exclusions, but we're seeing now that there is confusion around that. So that's why we're proposing to actually create these lists. So basically the proposed changes would mean almost everything is included. There's only kind of a minor number of exclusions that would apply to accessory buildings. So again, we're just trying to formalize these exclusions so that it's very clear, you know, things like crawl spaces and attics should really be excluded for every building. So the next topic will be the gross floor area calculation for carriage houses. So again, there's been a lot of confusion with this calculation. When the carriage house use was added to the bylaw, the intent was never for the general gross floor area calculation to apply to that. Everything for carriage houses is found within the CD1 zone. The CD1 zone is the only zone that permits carriage houses. So the gross floor area regulations around carriage houses are related to the density and the maximum size that are found within the CD1 zone. So they're listed on the screen here. No more than one dwelling and one auxiliary dwelling unit within a single family dwelling or a carriage house. The gross floor area of a principal dwelling shall be reduced by the total number or the total gross floor area of a dwelling unit. So up to a total of 90 square meters. And then the maximum gross floor area of a carriage house is 200 square meters with no more than 90 square meters dedicated to the auxiliary dwelling unit. So what that means is that there was never supposed to be any exclusions for a carriage house. Really, the intent was to limit this total size to 200 square meters and the 90 square meters for the actual auxiliary dwelling unit. So what we're proposing here, again, because there has been some confusion and we understand that, you know, some areas of the bylaw are a little bit unclear about that. We're proposing to actually have a specific list of inclusions and exclusions for carriage houses. So essentially, the carriage houses would have the same exclusions as an accessory building. The only difference is that we are providing that additional exclusion for unenclosed balconies, verandas, porches, and decks, up to the 20% of the allowable gross floor area of the auxiliary dwelling unit. So that would be of the 90 square meters. So I believe the maximum could be excluded would be 18 square meters for unenclosed balconies and decks. So the other exclusions you'll see there are the same as what's provided for an accessory building. So just to summarize what we're proposing for carriage houses, we've always had this requirement to have this maximum of 200 square meters for carriage houses and up to 90 square meters for the auxiliary dwelling unit portion. So what we're actually trying to do is provide a little bit more clarity as the main reason, but also to provide this additional exclusion for balconies and decks. So what we're actually doing is making it a little bit more lenient again in recognition of, people wanting things like balconies and decks for an auxiliary dwelling unit. Yeah, and so again, I'll just emphasize, really, we're trying to kind of formalize these specific inclusions and exclusions for carriage houses, because they are different from, other accessory buildings, and we do recognize that. So we're really trying to kind of, provided their own regulations, and yeah. So the final gross floor area that we're going to talk about is for cottages. They have their own regulations similar to carriage houses. They have their own section in the bylaw. So they've always had some kind of specific regulations related to gross floor area. They have a maximum gross floor area. They have a maximum height. It says that they cannot include a garage as any part of the building. And we're just proposing to include this list of exclusions for gross floor area, because again, we don't really have, we haven't had a formal list of exclusions that apply to all buildings. So that's why we're kind of trying to do it for each type of building. So they would have the same exclusions as carriage houses. So yeah, this one right now only specifies that a garage cannot be part of a cottage building. So again, we're just creating this full list of exclusions for gross floor area specific to cottages. So that is kind of it for the gross floor area stuff. Now we're going to move into the height regulations. So the first one I wanted to talk about was this regulation for elevation and flood construction level. I'm just gonna look here. So this regulation you see up on the screen here is existing within the bylaw. So there's a specific regulation that speaks to how height should be calculated if it's in the flood construction or flood protection area. So if a geotechnical engineer determines that it's within the flood construction or within the flood protection area, and they're required to meet a certain flood protection level or flood construction level, then often they'd have to bring in fill or something like that to raise it to flood construction level. So that height is calculated from the lower of average natural or average finished grade, just depending on how they determine that to be calculated. And the piece that you see highlighted there and crossed out is what's within the existing bylaw. And this has often been interpreted as kind of the general height regulation for most zones. It wasn't intended to be used that way, but because a lot of zones don't have height restrictions right now, that's kind of how it's being used. So in all but the agricultural and industrial zones, the height of principal buildings and structures shall not exceed 11 meters. So there are many cases where we feel that 11 meters is quite high, and that's why we're kind of proposing to remove this regulation, because it would become redundant. And then we're proposing to actually add specific height regulations for most zones. Some of them already have some height regulations, but yeah, most in the existing bylaw do not have height regulations. So again, there's this provision in the existing bylaw that limits the height to most zones to 11 meters. So we're proposing to remove that and create individual height regulations. So yeah, the intent really was not to use that 11-meter height as a height for all buildings in all zones. So we really feel that different zones and different buildings do require their own height regulations. And, you know, that's kind of standard in most local governments. They'll have individual height regulations depending on the building type and the zone. So that's really what we're proposing here. So for the rural and residential zones, specifically the R1, RR1, RR2, and RR3 zones, the maximum height we're proposing for single family dwellings is 9 meters. And we're also proposing 9 meters for duplexes, which applies only to 2 of those zones. For farm buildings, we're proposing 15 meters, which is already a regulation found throughout the bylaw, but we're just adding it for each zone where it applies. And then the maximum height for accessory buildings and structures we're proposing is 6 meters. So for tourist commercial zones, we're proposing, again, for the same uses, we're proposing the same height throughout. So for single family dwellings, we're proposing 9 meters. You'll see there's only one zone where we are proposing a slightly higher height for single family dwellings. For duplexes, we're proposing 9 meters. For tourism accommodation and indoor recreation, we're proposing 10 meters. And again, for farm buildings, 15 meters, and accessory buildings and structures, we're proposing 6 meters. So to summarize again, for rural, residential, and tourist commercial zones, there are no consistent height regulations. So what we're really proposing is to create these consistent height regulations that take into consideration different types of buildings and the different context of different zones. So the 11-meter restriction, again, for that height calculation and flood construction level was really never intended as a general height regulation. So for the CD1 zone, the Comprehensive Development 1 zone, also known as Wedgwoods Estates, we are proposing a slightly higher height for single family dwellings. We do recognize that there's some topography issues that make it more challenging to meet height. So we are proposing an additional 1 meter for single family dwellings, so a total of 10 meters. And then we also have added a height here specifically for carriage houses, and that height is 7 meters. And then the accessory building and structure height, where there's no auxiliary dwelling unit, would be 6 meters, as it is proposed for all other zones as well. So again, this zone was not subject to any type of height restriction before. So everything was kind of 11 meters. We are proposing specific height restrictions that, do consider the the unique kind of topography. And yeah, and we're breaking it out by building type. We do feel that the 10 meters is sufficient for single family dwellings, even given that topography, because we've only seen, looking at the 61 permits issued in Wedgwoods, 9 of them have been over 10 meters in height. So that's only about 15%. And yeah, we always do expect that there will be some people that, want to go a little bit higher. So for, if that's the case, there is still the option of going through a development variance permit. We're never going to expect that, there won't be any kind of variance requests for those types of things in our zoning bylaw. So for the agricultural zone, we're proposing to increase the height of farm residences and secondary farm residences. Under the current bylaw, it's set to 8 meters for those two uses, as well as the temporary farm worker housing. We are proposing for farm residents and secondary farm residents to raise this a little bit higher to 9 meters. For temporary farm worker housing, this is typically, like mobile homes and ATCO trailers, kind of those less permanent structures. So, comparing that to what we allow in our mobile home park bylaw, which is 7.6 meters, we feel that 8 meters is still very reasonable for that use. So we're proposing to keep that one the same. And again, the farm buildings is already in there as 15 meters, so we're not proposing any changes there. And this zone already actually has a height restriction for accessory buildings and structures of 6 meters, so we're also not proposing any changes there. So looking at the existing regulations, this zone actually already has height restrictions in place for all different uses. So what we're actually proposing is a slight increase in height for farm residents and secondary farm residents, just to be consistent with what we're proposing for kind of that same use as single family dwelling in other zones. So industrial uses, we have 3 industrial zones actually in our zoning bylaw, this I1, I2, and I3. This doesn't apply to the I3 zone just because it is very site specific and it already has a building on the property. So we're not proposing to have an additional height restriction there. So for the I1 and I2 zone, we're proposing 9 meters for the single family dwelling use. And for all other buildings and structures in those industrial zones, we're proposing 12 meters. This seems to be in line with what we're seeing in other places. And we feel that 12 meters is, a very average kind of height for industrial, a maximum height for industrial zones. So getting into the camping definitions, we're proposing kind of 2 changes in our bylaw to clarify how we've always kind of looked at this. So what we're proposing is to amend our recreational vehicle definition to clarify kind of 2 things. So to clarify that RVs are designed specifically to travel or to be transported on a highway, and that they must be connected to wheels, again, to be transported on a highway. And we're proposing to add this requirement for designation, so that either the CSA Z240 RV or CSA Z241 park model standards. We've done a lot of research on this, and this is what a lot of local governments do. So the definition that we're proposing here is very much in line with what we're seeing in other places. We're also proposing to add this camping unit definition. Again, just to clarify kind of what is considered an RV, and, you know, the different kind of types of more kind of temporary camping uses. So I just want to highlight the last sentence there. Camping unit does not include park model trailers or tiny homes where sited on a permanent foundation. So the reason we put this in there is to clarify, I guess I'll go to the next slide, to kind of clarify this difference between what we consider a dwelling unit and what we consider a portable recreational vehicle type of use. So, you know, like a tiny house on a permanent foundation would be required to go through a building permit and would need to meet the building code. We do know that they often struggle to meet building code, but that would be the requirement because it's considered a dwelling unit when it's on a foundation. So this other type, you know, like a tiny house on wheels or an RV, those are considered the same thing in terms of our regulations. And that's how we've always considered it. We have, I think, going back to like 2016, that's the kind of communication that we've tried to put out there. But I think in our current bylaw, it's not super clear. So what we're trying to do here is really clarify that language and, you know, make sure there's kind of that understanding of the permanent dwelling unit versus, you know, a more portable camping unit or recreational vehicle. So again, the reason for these changes to the camping definitions is really to clarify where these different kind of things fall. So we are seeing, you know, more and more of these tiny homes on wheels. So that was kind of part of the reason we wanted to clarify this language. Yeah, so that it's very clear that a tiny home on wheels is not considered a dwelling unit. So some other kind of more minor amendments, I'll just quickly go over. It's here. So we're adding some specific uses that would be permitted in all zones. The first one is horticulture. So this is currently undefined in our bylaw, and it was permitted under a couple of rural residential zones, but really horticulture is, you know, like gardening, growing crops. So we're adding a definition and specifically allowing that in all zones. We're adding wireless communication facility as a use permitted in all zones. Under the current regulations, it's a little bit confusing because the public utility use kind of speaks to wireless communication facility as well. So we're kind of trying to clarify that because there is a little bit of a difference. And wireless communication facilities are things like radio towers or cell towers, which we actually don't regulate. Typically, you know, if it's communication that's national or international, that's regulated provincially or federally. So yeah, we're just allowing that as a use in all zones. And then we're also adding day nursery specifically to rural, residential, and tourism commercial zones. So this is essentially like a childcare facility. So yeah, we just feel that that's a use that should be permitted in all of those zones. And then we've got some new or amended definitions. So we're amending our definition of structure to specifically exclude unenclosed swimming pools and hot tubs. The reason being that under our bylaw right now, we have, you know, kind of density restrictions on accessory buildings and structures in certain zones. So, you know, the way it reads right now is swimming pool or a hot tub could technically be included in that density calculation. So, you know, if somebody's only allowed, say, 1 or 2 accessory buildings, their swimming pool or their hot tub would count towards that. So we just feel that that shouldn't count towards an accessory building. So we're choosing to exclude that from the definition of structure. We've added a definition of attached to differentiate between attached and unattached. So attached would mean anything that's attached to the building, either by a common wall or by the foundation. The wireless communication facility, I kind of mentioned already. This is not a use that we can really prohibit, so we're just updating the language around that. And then the retaining wall regulations, we're proposing to update those to kind of clarify siting related to a property line. We've had some issues with interpretation of these regulations and, how high somebody can build a retaining wall right at the property line. So we're just proposing to kind of tweak that language to make it more clear which height restriction for retaining walls applies, to which part of the property. Okay, so kind of moving on to the next section, I just want to go over quickly what the next steps would be in this process. So we're going to compile and analyze this kind of initial public input that we've got. So we've received some public input already prior to this meeting. Anything that we hear kind of through this meeting, or, if we receive correspondence afterwards, we will compile that and, summarize all the comments specifically from this meeting and bring it back to a future SLRD board meeting for consideration. So really, depending on the outcome of this meeting and what we hear, we can choose to bring this back for second reading as is. We could choose to make some amendments to the bylaw and bring it back for second reading with amendments, or we could go right to the board and ask them, basically how we should proceed. So ask them, what they would like us to do. When we do ask for second reading, that's typically when we would ask to schedule a public hearing. So again, that's that more kind of formal opportunity to provide public input. And at that time, or after the public hearing, the board can kind of choose how they'd like to proceed. So they could adopt or defeat the bylaw, or they could alter certain sections of the bylaw without kind of being required to go through a public process again, provided that it doesn't alter use, density. So you'll see there's some specific stipulations as to when it would have to come back for public input. But if not, the board could choose to adopt a bylaw, like give it third reading and adopt it in the same meeting. So that's kind of the process moving forward. And again, a lot of this depends on the SLRD board and what they decide to do as kind of a next step. So I just want to put that up there. If you haven't already viewed the website, this is where you'll find any updates. So I can put that up again at the very end, but yeah, I'll just move it into discussion now, and I'll exit out of my thing so I can actually see comments and things.
Brenda, if it's helpful, we have had a couple of questions come in through the Zoom, like the online participants. I don't know if we want to maybe take one from the online, and then we can see if we have anyone in the room that has some questions. I'll just help to sort of moderate that space.
That sounds great. Yeah, I'm just trying to find my video again so I can actually see.
So one question we had here and was define enclosed, please, i.e. covered. Does that mean enclosed?
So enclosed, I don't have the exact definition in front of me, but basically, if something has walls, windows, doors, that's considered enclosed. So I can find the kind of the exact definition. We're not proposing to make any changes specifically to that definition. But I'll,
The question came forward when we were discussing the enclosed versus unenclosed exclusions. And Dave, do you have any?
There's a definition of how we interpret enclosed in the area C zoning bylaw and the definitions.
yeah, I've just brought it up. So, so in the context specifically of balconies, verandas, porches, patios, or decks, and gross floor area calculations, enclosed means 60% or more of the total perimeter of the balcony, veranda, porch, patio, or deck structure surrounded by exterior walls, doors, or windows.
Yeah, and just to speak to that, so we've increased the exclusions from 10% to 20%, and that was really because we were hearing from the design community, architects and others, that they were saying 10% was really limiting, and it was causing people to have smaller decks and balconies than they actually would have liked, because it was eating into their total GFA. And so that's why we're proposing to up it. It's really for livability, so that people can have a nice deck and balcony to sit out on.
Is the 20%, is that total for all balconies, decks, and everything else on that list, or is it per occurrence? So if you have a deck on one side of the building, can that be up to 20% of the GFA, as well as another deck on the other side of the building? Because this isn't really clear.
It would be your total decking would have a 20%.
Per building though.
Per building. So your total decking per building would be required to be 20%.
Okay, so if there's decks above grade, and then does it also include patios on grade and everything else on that list?
So there's specific inclusions and exclusions, right? So I'll pull that up again. So
Because the language used here, unenclosed balconies, verandas, porches, or decks. Doesn't say and decks, it says or decks that exceed 20%. So that word or indicates that the 20% would apply to each one of those items listed on the list individually, not collectively.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, it probably actually should say and decks.
yeah, I believe the intent is for it to be a total of all of those.
So good catch.
Well, I think this is where a lot of the issue is coming from with the existing zoning bylaw, is that the language is not very clear in a lot of cases. So with this new amendment bylaw, it would be good to go forward with clearer and more precise language, so we don't have these gray areas.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we're here.
We're trying to make it clearer, so we definitely do appreciate any feedback on interpretation.
Okay. So just because we're on this subject, I mean, my comment is that 20% is still too restrictive when we're talking about the total of all outdoor spaces around a building. So for example, in Wedgwoods, using the 430 limit for the smaller lots there, the 430 square meter gross floor area limit. So 20% of that, okay, it's a little over 100 square meters, but 100 square meters allocated to an outdoor patio and all of the decks is not enough. 10% is crazy too small, 20% is still too small. And when we start looking at applying that to a carriage house, and we're talking about 20% of that area, again, too small. So like, it's just going to be too restrictive on patios, particularly. Like, I don't really understand why we're including patios when we have to include patios. So I understand the definition of an unenclosed patio, but I don't understand the definition of an attached patio, a patio that's attached to a building or structure. So I think from a design point of view, including patios at all on grade is excessive. I can understand some limitation to outdoor spaces above grade from a building massing point of view, but I don't think that having any restriction on outdoor space is appropriate. So that's kind of where I'm starting at.
Did you get that, Brenda?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
Sorry, definition of a patio is not a structure, so it's something on grade typically, is it not?
There's no current definition for
A
patio.
patio. Okay. When you read on the right, it's sort of saying that the patios are excluded if they're not attached. So if it's on grade, even though it's still what's attached to the house, if it's up against the foundation as part, it's called attached, or you get into some definition terms here that becomes really unclear for sure. You see it.
And I think one of the reasons we have these inclusions and exclusions is that what we have seen in the past is if there is space attached to a house, it's easy to enclose it later. And so we've seen that happen quite a bit, or things like carports, right? They often get enclosed after the fact. So that's why we're trying to create these differences.
Got another question here from our online participants. Am I correct to assume accessory buildings are occupied and do not include structures used for agriculture? And this specifically came forward, Brenda, when the table about accessory buildings and GFA was being discussed. So I think maybe just clarifying that farm buildings aren't included.
Yeah,
Or just-
that's right. Yeah, so farm buildings, if they meet that definition, because we do specifically define, I think in our bylaw, what a farm building is. Those would not apply to for that gross floor area calculation. We don't have the same restrictions there.
Are there any questions in the room? We do have a few more online.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just had a quick question, mention like secondary farm residents, I don't remember what the term that you're changing it to is exactly. And that having farm status for BC assessment was gonna be part of that, kind of skipping the extra application, and I'm wondering what's gonna be used to evaluate that, is that current farm status, is that how many years of farm status, is that a guarantee of future farm status? Because obviously BC assessment farm status is an annual thing.
It would be current farm status.
So current, like when the application is put through, current when you start building, current when the geocheck report gets done, like, what are you asking for?
We'll ask for that at the building permit stage. So just to clarify, that requirement was already in the bylaw for both temporary farm worker housing and what was previously called farm employee farm employee residence. So that's not a new requirement. It is something that is already in the bylaw for those two types of uses.
Yeah, just a clarification on cottage house, carriage house. I didn't see any reference to that being in farm rural areas. Is it in rural areas or that's outside of rural? Because the way I'm reading it is you're gonna have a primary dwelling, a secondary dwelling for your farm worker or someone else, and then temporary farm worker housing, also cottage and carriage.
Brenda?
Sorry, you're talking specifically about on agricultural properties?
Yes.
Yeah, so cottage and a carriage house is not a permitted use in the agricultural zone. So the permitted uses like that are kind of the residential permitted uses in the agricultural zone are a farm residence, which is essentially a single family dwelling. That additional residence, so the secondary farm residence, if it meets those specific requirements. And then the temporary farm worker housing is only permitted through that ALC application.
Okay.
Another question here from our online participants. Does clarifying the definition of RVs and camping assist the SOD in enforcing existing bylaws that prohibit permanent living in these vehicles on properties, ? We know that the SRD currently does not enforce these bylaws even after complaints from adjacent properties. And there was comment and a question and a comment there.
I don't know, Kim, if you have have kind of an answer for this, but I think, making these changes, this is kind of moving forward how we would look at these things. So I'm not sure what that would mean for existing RVs and things like that. Enforcement, I think, typically is done on a complaint basis. So yeah, I'm not sure. Kim, do you have more to kind of say about
Yeah.
that?
Well, I think to the first question, yes, like clarifying the definition is definitely helpful. And then the comment about the enforcement, well, we don't, speak to individual enforcement cases, but we are aware there are a lot of infractions out there. And it's kind of like whack-a-mole, like one goes away and another one pops up and they're all over the SLRD, and we go on a complaint basis. And sometimes our staff find these things. We've discovered all sorts of things on various visits to properties. So we try and enforce our bylaws where we can. And we do the best we can do with limited resources.
I just see someone said they have a question that's too lengthy. So this person's put their hand up. I'll let them speak, but I just want to mention that if anyone wants to actually, if you have a long question or want to speak in more detail to your question that's on Zoom, please raise your hand and I can allow you to speak. So I'll just go to Nikki here.
Hi,
Hi, Nikki.
thank you for your presentation. I just have a question because it wasn't addressed in the presentation, but online under the general housekeeping amendments that were proposed, there was a section at the very end under the RR1 zone saying that the proposed changes would allow for only one dwelling on parcels that are under 2 hectares. Previously, I believe that there was a permitted use for a cottage on parcels 1 hectare or greater. So can you clarify if you're removing that allowance?
Sorry, which one are you speaking to specifically? I'm just going to pull up.
On the second reading for the request for a decision that's on the page of your public information section. At the very bottom of page 4, there is a line heading RR1 residential zone. Updates are proposed to section 5.112 and 5.183 to clarify the uses that specifically apply to RR1 zones.
Okay, yeah, so this wasn't really a change. I think we're not proposing any changes to the use here. I think it was just updating the language. Let me just compare to what I've got in
The
bylaw.
existing zone says that parcels 1 hectare or greater are permitted to have a cottage on the property, whereas the way that this is worded is saying that parcels under 2 hectares may include 1 dwelling with a secondary suite. So are you removing the allowance for a cottage?
I think you're speaking to a different regulation. This regulation in the current bylaw reads, on parcels 1 hectare or greater, the additional permitted uses are 1 cottage or a secondary dwelling unit to create a duplex, garden, nursery, or home industry. So what we're changing here is to exclude that RR1 residential subzone. Is that what you're speaking about?
Yeah, so I'm just looking for
Okay.
clarity because it's the way that it's worded on that proposal seems like you're taking away the allowance for a cottage on parcels 1 hectare or greater.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna have to get back to you on that one. I can't remember exactly what the intent of that change was.
Okay, I can email my question. And then I have one other
Okay.
one. It's just probably more directed towards Jay. For the FCL levels, does that include freeboarding? So if a geotech recommended 207 geodetic meters to be the recommended FCL for construction, if there was a freeboard in that as well, would you be building at 207 or would you be building within the allowed freeboard?
Underside of floor joists have to be above 207.
Okay. So I just wanted clarity on that one as well. If the natural grade was say 205 and you added 2 meters of preload to bring it to the FCL, which would be 207, you would be allowed max height to be calculated from that 207 and not the 205.
I think the way, actually, this is a better question for Arlene, if she's still there. We calculate height starting at FCL. So it's with the exclusions for livable space below flood construction level, it ends up being more advantageous, but
Yeah, it was just the way that the slide was proposed said the definitions between average natural grade. So I'm just wondering if that is where you're calculating height from, or would it be from whatever the recommended FCL is that the geotech is supporting?
in the floodplain, we count height starting from the FCL, not average natural.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Arlene has just confirmed that too in her in the chat here.
All right, perfect.
Good
Thank you.
question, Nikki.
That's all, thanks.
Any further questions from the room? Hannah? Thanks. Thanks for doing this meeting and helping us understand everything. I'm confused about if the, I'm looking at a phrase from your summary to the AEC and that's on the project page. It says staff are suggesting that the zoning bylaw be aligned with the above conditions for temporary farm worker housing. The following additional conditions are also proposed to be enforced by the SLRD. And then it goes into the public health act, the building code, geotech, and flood home and home plate. So if those are already in the zoning bylaw, why are they being like highlighted or added now? What's happening there?
So really what we're just trying to do is change the language to reflect that this is an ALC application. So we're basically dividing it up in the zoning bylaw to show what the requirements are for that, what's now an ALC application. And then the conditions that we are kind of keeping as part of our regulations.
So why are you saying in this it's proposed to be enforced? But right now
Well, they're proposed changes right now, right? They're proposed amendments. So this is what we as staff are proposing, and you know, we can't really say it that it's enforced because it's up to the board to decide if they want to adopt this bylaw.
So currently it's not enforced in the bylaw as it stands right now.
Well, it is, it's just in different terms because it's an SLRD application in the current bylaw.
Okay. So if one were to apply for that, they would have to meet those conditions under the current situation.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, we're not changing the conditions. It's just that most of these conditions are now under an ALC application.
Okay, it does seem like I'm president of the Farmers Institute. I don't want to intimidate anyone here, but I am. And we are just sort of getting trying to figure this all out because we're coming a little late in the game, I think, to figuring out the zoning bylaw. And it does seem like we're in a bit of a pickle here because farming is not going to be viable if we're building these kinds of structures for our May till October workers. It's just not, the numbers don't add up. Farming in Pemberton is very viable. But it doesn't stay viable if we have to build this kind of a structure to these standards for our temporary workers that are here from May to October. Lots of us are leasing land, for example, and certainly won't be making that kind of capital investment on leased land. Some of us are on 5 acres and farming 4.85 of that, and have our house there and the driveway there, and the rest is farm. We certainly don't want to take up a lot more space with preload to make flood construction level. The last thing we want to see as the Farmers Institute is more gravel on farmland. There's quite enough of that going on. We don't want to see any more permanent structures on farmland. There's also quite a lot of that going on. We're just very, very concerned that this, the fact that it's existing already is testament to the fact that we've just had our heads down, not paying attention, because it's not, we're not asking the SLRD to make farming viable or do anything like that. We can make it viable. We just don't want it to become unviable because of bylaws requirements that we just can't financially do. We're in the process of passing a formal resolution with our board, and we'd like to be part of the discussion and the solution, but we would like you to know that we're pretty concerned about it. That was not a question. I do have a question. Have you had, or how many camping units are allowed under the ALC? Do we know, do you know that offhand?
Camping units or temporary farm worker housing?
Well, I'm curious of, as a camping, like what's a camping unit? Are we allowed to have certain nights of camping on our farm properties, or what's the rule?
So, yeah, it's up to the ALC, but if somebody is making an application for this temporary farm worker housing, they have kind of some specific criteria on, you know.
I'm just asking, just apart from the housing, don't say housing because then you want a building permit. I'm just asking about camping right now, and what are the existing rules under the ALC for camping on ALR land?
I don't know if anyone else knows the answer to that. Like if it's considered a campground by the ALC, I believe that's a non-farm use. I don't know if Claire or Kim, you know, a bit more about.
I mean, camping's not the subject of this particular bylaw, but yeah, it would be a non-farm use application if one wanted to do that. But I think it would be tricky to get something like that through, simply because, you know, the ALC of course sees the agricultural land reserve as being a place for farming, not for camping, right? So they would prefer to see camping in like the rural resource properties.
Yeah. And then have you got any permits out right now for temporary farm worker housing? Has anyone applied, been through the process, got a permit from the SLRD, got approval?
I'm just aware of one temporary farm worker housing project.
Yeah, just one. Yeah. I don't have any more questions. Thank you.
Does anyone want to speak to the whole issue of the temporary farm worker housing? And just the whole, this whole issue of, you know, building safety, et cetera, and why typically we would want to see these permitted?
Well, we want to see it safe too. Like, we're not interested in our workers living in squalor, and we'll lose workers. Like if I just have a terrible accommodation for my workers with no running water and no hot water, and tell them Naomi's got Shangri-La down there, then they're going to go to Naomi and I'm not going to get any workers. So it's, and to a certain degree, we're going to take care of that just purely our customers come to the farm all the time. Most of us are open farms. They're gonna be appalled if they see that sort of thing. So to a certain extent, it's a moot point in terms of, you know, and for the flood, like a lot of us have been through a few floods now, and there's one thing I know for sure is it looks different every single time. Could come from there, it could come from there, it could come from anywhere. And the water comes up, it soaks whatever it's gonna soak, and then it goes away again. It's not like the debris torrent that's also hanging over our heads. So it's a manageable situation, and you kind of have to learn how to manage it when you're farming in the floodplain. It's something we all deal with all the time. And when we know it's coming, the precious stuff goes to high ground. Like everything stops, the goods, everything gets taken to high ground. If it's a tiny home on wheels, off it goes to high ground. That just seems to me that there's a few nuances, or not even nuances, like really important factors at play here in our farming community. And communities up and down the Sea to Sky have made some pretty serious commitments to reducing their carbon. And the best way to do that is to ensure local food supply. And if we tell people, well, sorry, we're out of business because we've had to build a house to floodplain level, for workers that are only there from May to October, and that has to stand empty all winter with the pipes freezing, it doesn't look good. And it's not going to help with the local food system.
So I know that the ALC does consider recreational vehicles to be a dwelling. So that's how they see it when they're looking at these things.
I think they say a temporary foundation and a flatting around the base is what they want to see. There's
That
pretty
is,
clear.
yeah, their criteria kind of states that they prefer that. But yeah, I mean, they maybe would look at an RV differently than we would. But I think just to speak to the health and safety stuff a little bit, you know, as a local government, it's kind of on us to ensure health and safety. You know, the ALC has very little in terms of enforcement capacity. So a lot of that stuff kind of falls on the local government. So, you know, things like flood protection and servicing, things like that, you know, concerns we have related to health and safety, there's really nothing we can do with enforcement if we don't have a building permit. So really the reason that we want to have a building permit for these things is to ensure that we're able to kind of, you know, enforce some standards. Otherwise, we don't really have anything, you know, in order to enforce on these things when we see infractions and, you know, when we see like multiple RVs on a property. So that's kind of our concern.
Yeah, well, I know that you can go on properties given the proper amount of notice, I think. You're not prevented from going on.
Yeah, and the challenge really is, you know, a lot of these sorts of structure, well, I guess they're RVs or tiny homes, anything on wheels, essentially, they're not serviced, right? So we have no idea where the sewage is going, where the water is coming from. It can become very messy, and we've seen this in the meadows. It's going on now, and it's actually causing neighbor disputes from smells and concerns about water and wells, etc. Right? Because you can get pollutants, and it can get very messy. And I know I appreciate your concerns for sure about the costs of, you know, having to deal with some of these safety measures, but it's a bit of a balancing act because that can be pretty problematic, and some of these RVs are really not fit for habitation as well, right? And some tiny homes as well. We have no idea how they were constructed, right? Some RVs and some of these can come from the States or places where they don't have snow, so they're not built to the right certification, so they can't handle snow load, and so there's a public risk, definitely.
Well, yeah, I mean, anyone that's got their RVs out uncovered, unprotected in the snow has lost them now. It just takes one winter. It just takes one December snowfall and it's all over. So I understand your concerns. I mean, I think I said somewhere, we don't like to see farmland covered in things that aren't farming either. But I guess we're just saying to you that there's a disconnect. And we're small and medium-sized farms. We're not big, heavily capitalized, massive production units. With a variety of ownership and leasing structures and a lot of challenges. And we can make a go of it. And we need the workers. So we're not going to be getting away with substandard housing just purely based on market. We're all looking for workers right now. If you were to look on the farming employment pages, you'd see like 10 Pemberton farms looking for workers right now. So we're in competition with one another to provide something. And it changes too. Like sometimes you'll get 5 people who know people in town and have relatives, places to live. So you don't need anything. You don't need any housing. Other times it's somebody that really wants the farming lifestyle, wants to park their RV in the garage for a few months and work on the farm and see what it's like. That's how you teach farming. Like,
Just a comment, I think if we're gonna require temporary farm worker housing to be on a foundation in a building, you might as well put a third dwelling unit on a farm property, really. What you're
the same
getting to.
thing. So, yeah.
That's what you're getting to.
And that's the other thing, you can do that. You can meet all these requirements if you've got tons of money. But money is not a prerequisite for being a good farmer. And all it is a ability to spend a lot and comply with local zoning. And then you've got yourself a nice little set of dwellings to rent out or do whatever you want to do with. You could really do it up. And so it doesn't do anything for actual food production.
So strengthen the health and safety of RVs and tiny homes on farmers' property so that they can comply with that, which is the least expensive option for them to get temporary workers on their farm, is probably a better solution than where you're running down now, in my view.
I think it'd be good to, like, you're saying that, this is already happening, that you've already seen it, whatever enforcement that's happening is happening or not happening, but like, there's a big elephant in the room that's like, well, like, why is this happening? Like, we have a housing crisis in our region, we have a food production crisis, like however far you want to look. And so I don't think anyone who is already doing it, or whatever, like, I don't know what those people are thinking, but like, I don't think anyone's trying to be a terrible like, people aren't getting into farming so that they can be a substandard landlord. Like, we're just trying to grow food, right? So like, I'm sorry, but like, I would like it if my employees could find housing nearby in the meadows, but if you could start enforcing like some of the other bylaws that you have about like short-term rental, like there are tons of illegal short-term rentals that I would gladly rent for my employees and offer as seasonal housing or as long-term housing for people who want to work here and want to work at like a livable wage in our region. Like, when the SLRD is putting something behind that, like, please, like, by all means, like, ask us to build fancy housing for workers, but like, I want to be a farmer. Like, I don't want to have RVs and I don't want to be a landlord, but like, we need people to grow food. So like, I'm sorry, like, I know that's not what this meeting is about, but like, please have some context, we're not like everywhere else. Like, we are a rural community and a farming community, and the living wage here is the same as in Metro Vancouver if you look at it. So like, come on.
I have a question. I don't know much about the situation, but how important is it for the farm workers to be actually living on the farming property? Like, is there another solution which consolidates like a number of temporary, not necessarily a campground or a RV ground, but like a temporary living facility that.
Well, like Naomi said, she'd be happy to rent out, one of the suites that's currently being Airbnb'd. I think there's like 400
If it was
on Airbnb
it's just,
today.
like, what is affordable housing at
Yeah.
working
I'm just
wages
seeing-
for a farmer? Like, I would love that.
A
I
few
would
years
love
ago, there
it.
was some proposals for Whistler for the same kind of thing, which are, the modular buildings which are delivered to site and it's to be consolidated for seasonal workers on one property, and it's fully serviced. So you don't have these issues of servicing and sewer and whatever else that isn't connected. So, this is a project, right? But maybe it's a public project. Maybe there's some talk about
Well,
that.
if it was a financially viable thing, then probably someone would do it. It's interesting that nobody has. It's
Yeah.
not very
Just-
easy.
Further to your comment about temporary farm workers are typically from another country. They may not have a driver's license, so having them on the farm is not paramount, but it certainly makes everybody's life easier. And they're there to work, so they just walk to work. There they go. They're here to make some money. They're not getting in Mexico or Venezuela or wherever, so it can be a greater advantage that the farm worker is on the farm. It's just a given.
Sometimes it's annoying to have them on the farm. It's too close for comfort.
I'd like to speak to your point and kind of run with it for a moment. These are people who are not familiar with the flood tendencies and the natural hazards that are
Certainly.
ever looming over our heads here in the Pemberton Belt. I don't live here, so I can't really speak to it. But this is in essence why we don't want to see one day after a catastrophic flood, water up to the windows of however many RVs because they weren't parked high enough to withstand this. And now we've got a catastrophic loss of life on our hands because they were unaware.
That's not the kind of flood we get. We don't get.
You don't know that, and that neither do we.
Well, we haven't made any rules about the debris torrent that's totally been engineered and predicted in the same way. Like that is loss of life, but there's nothing about that.
Can I just mention, I've got a number of questions that aren't related to this, so I'm not sure how much more time we have, but
I just have one question in response to that I think is kind of important, like this seasonal, we're not talking about the whatever seasonal agricultural worker.
Foreign worker.
Like the foreign worker program, like that has its own set of inspections.
Federal and provincial.
Federal and provincial, and that is very clearly designed to avoid that sort of confusion and essentially that sort of exploitation that exists, like because you have people who are coming to work whose work permits are tied to their employer and often their housing is tied to their employer. And so no, maybe they don't know it, right? And they don't have, like, they're in a position where they're here to work and picking up and going to work on someone else's farm because there is safer housing is actually not an option if they want to keep their jobs, because that's how that program works. So they have their own set of inspectors, and I'm sure you're familiar with that program, and their housing levels are up to a certain standard. And there are people who are paid lots of money in the federal government to make that happen. We are not talking about people whose working and housing arrangements are tied and their working in this country is tied to being on my farm or on Michelle's farm. That is its own program.
Yeah, we're talking about people from Oliver or something that want to come work on.
We're talking about people who have options
Yeah,
and want to
have
come here and
options,
want to work in farming and want to be in Pemberton and want to grow food here.
They're making a pretty clear choice anyway. They're coming to a heat dome, they're coming to fly. Like it's not pretty.
Apologize, everybody. I have to go.
Thanks for
Thank you.
coming out.
Yeah.
Game, hope you score, make it worthwhile.
There's a couple of questions here from our online participants. One is local government allows RVs as temporary housing while building a home. Could they not then consider RVs in the same light when it comes to temporary housing in agriculture? In brackets, both as exceptions, as both are not necessarily ideal or perfectly to code, but could both be permitted in these isolated special cases. They are both just temporary uses for different reasons. It seems like RVs are permitted in some cases for living. Does food security not seem like a good reason for this additional exception?
So I think I can speak to that. That specific regulation around occupying an RV when you're building a house is tied to a building permit. So that building permit is kind of like our security that they would remove that RV once that home is constructed. So it is kind of the same idea, like there's still a building permit involved in that instance.
Another question, and then I think we'll shift to some other questions related to the other aspects of the zoning bylaw. I would like to see the SRD conduct an economic feasibility study in relation to temporary farm worker housing proposals, specifically addressing the small to medium-sized farms that populate area C.
I have a range of other questions that kind of bring the discussion back to gross floor area and the height regulation.
Okay.
I see Jay just stepped out. Some of these might be answerable by him, but okay, so just starting from the top here, carriage houses are currently allowed to be built prior to any other building in Wedgwoods. Does the current bylaw, does the zoning amendment intend to change that?
So I don't believe we're proposing any changes to that. I'm not super familiar with that regulation because it is existing and yeah, we're not proposing any changes there. But I believe the way that that's implemented is that the carriage house is kind of considered the principal building until the actual principal building is built. So it would still need to meet those carriage house provisions. But it's kind of converted to this carriage house at a, once the principal building is there. I'm not sure if somebody else can kind of clarify that further, but that's my understanding.
It was just a proposal, like that we changed that just to help with affordability, because some people said, well, we can't afford to build our big house yet, but we can afford the carriage house. So we made an exception and changed the rules so that people could build the carriage house before the principal building.
Yeah, I think that it's very important for affordability, that's for sure. I think that's why most people are doing it. I know, I mean, just to kind of introduce myself, I'm a landowner in Wedgwoods, but I'm also a professional building designer. I've had a couple of client projects approved in Wedgwoods with Jay. We have 2 more projects in design right now. And this is a situation where both of these new projects intend to construct a carriage house first. And I guess the principal dwelling later. So I wanted to make sure that, playing around with all the new wording between principal building and accessory building doesn't have an unintended consequence of affecting that bylaw that allows us to build the carriage house first. So I think we can just leave that one there. That's, I think, clear. Okay, so when we're designing these houses, I mean, any architect or designer that I've spoken to, including myself, understand the current building height limitation to be 11 meters in the current zoning bylaw. I understand that what Brenda is saying, that there's some confusion about that, and that there is actually no limit to buildings other than specifically noted for specific zoning. So for example, in Wedgwoods, and most of my questions do relate to Wedgwoods specifically, but they do apply to all the other zonings too. So the understanding right now is that the maximum building height is 11 meters. I mean, that's what we all design to. We don't exceed it. We, in some cases, as far as my business is concerned, we always show a height calculation to show that we're complying to the 11 meters. So why do we need to reduce it to 10 meters? So I guess what I'm looking for here is some better rationale than we feel that 10 meters is the right number. I mean, I think that what we need to be looking at here is some very specific examples, testing out building heights, allowing a 3-story building as per Part 9 of the building code to be built. And at the moment, I would say, based on all my previous experience and designs in Wedgwoods, that 10 meters is not always going to be high enough. I mean, some of the rationale here from Brenda's introduction does mention that 15% of the previously submitted and approved building permits in Wedgwoods exceeds 10 meters. Well, 15% is a significant number. And I would also question the where that data pool originated from, because we have 6 different phases in Wedgwoods. There's been very few houses built in phase 5. There's no houses in phase 6 right now. And there's a few houses in phase 4, but it's nowhere near a comprehensive data set. So most of the examples that I think Brenda would have pulled to analyze are closer to the valley floor. So there's also no correlation between the results of Brenda's data test with topography or slope. So in my opinion, that analysis is almost related. I mean, the result is basically 0. We can't rely on that data to formulate an appropriate building height in Wedgwoods or anywhere else at the moment. So I think what needs to be looked at, for example, modern building assemblies. So a lot of the houses we're starting to design to meet energy efficiency requirements, which SLID has not adopted the step code yet, but it's coming. And the typical step code compliant house now is usually using reverse cycle heat pumps. So those heat pumps provide ducted air. Those ducts require spaces in the ceilings. So to maintain a desirable ceiling height of approximately 9 feet, we're going to assemblies such as parallel cord truss joists for floors and roofs. Now those truss joists are minimum 2 feet deep by engineering standards. So the typical truss joist right now for an internal floor could be as shallow as 9.5 inches. So or up to say 12 inches. So we're essentially adding an extra foot per level of the house. So if you do have 2 interior floors and a roof, you've automatically added 3 feet in structural depth to the building. And therefore, to maintain a 9-foot desirable ceiling height, internal clear ceiling height, you've added 3 feet to the total building height already. And that's before we start talking about insulation on top of the roof deck. So 10 meters is not enough.
Your measurements don't change from 2 by 10 or 2 by 12, and those nominal measurements have been the same for about 75 or 80 years now. TGIs at the same time.
Okay, so I'm not, so, okay, so I'm talking
So
about.
we're adding 3 feet to your house. We've always added 3 feet to our house because those depths of traditional framing lumber versus engineered lumber haven't changed.
Okay, so that's not what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about traditional lumber or engineered joists versus parallel cord truss joists. So this is like the roof trusses that you might imagine, traditionally a triangle shape. They have a bottom cord. So what we're doing now is we're using 2-foot high parallel cord trusses. So they're essentially flat. Okay, so the minimum structural depth of those is 2 feet. So now we've gone from a traditional 2 by 12 or 11/7/8 TJI for an interior floor to a 2-foot deep truss for a floor. So it raises the interior measurements. And so once we stack all of that up, we're getting buildings that are, a foot higher per floor and roof.
Who's building truss floors?
Sorry?
Who's building truss floors?
My 2 most recent projects have truss floors, and we have a parallel cord truss on the roof of one. So this has an approved building permit. I know lot 105. So that's an RDC fine home project. They use the same parallel cord trusses there. I don't know if it's for their internal floors, but they certainly use it for the roof. So anyway, so we might be getting a little bit off point here. The point is that when we start considering energy efficiency, and we need spaces for these ducts. When we start considering building affordability, a parallel cord truss is cheaper. It allows us to drop the ceiling, put all the ducts through there, all the lights through there, and keep the building envelope, if it's a roof, above, and the insulation all above that. So it's a more affordable way of building. It's a more efficient way of building. it's cheaper, but it does require some overall height increase to the total building height. So the other factor on this is that when we start going to more energy efficient buildings, we start adding insulation on top of the roof deck. Now, it may only be 6 inches, but it's all adding up, and 10 meters is not enough.
So point taken, I hear your comments about step code, et cetera, requiring more of these features. So Whistler has adopted the step code and has had it for a number of years. Their height is 7.6 meters, and granted, their calculation is slightly different than ours. But how are they making it work within 7.6 meters? And you're telling me you can't do it here within 10 meters. I'm interested to know.
Okay, so
why.
the comparison between the building height calculation in SLRD and Whistler is completely different. The methodology of calculating height is completely different. So just one example of that is that in Whistler, we're allowed to take the proposed grade as the finished grade. But here we have to use the lower of finished or proposed grade and natural grade. So if we're filling a lot, automatically we have to use a lower number. So that's what makes it more difficult here. So in RMOW, it's completely different. It's apples and oranges. So they use a weighted average of the roof areas and heights, and it can be manipulated. So for example, if you increase the roof area of a first story roof and reduce the area of an upper story roof, you can comply on paper using their methodology with 7.6 meters. But 7.6 meters is not a blanket height restriction in RMOW. So I'm working on another project in RMOW that has I don't recall exactly, but I think it's a 10 or an 11 meter height restriction.
Probably Caden Wood or something.
It's a Blackcomb benchlands, but you know, when we're talking about comparing Wedgwoods to the topography of somewhere like Cadenwood, it's the same thing. So yes, there are higher paper building height limitations for different zonings, but the really important thing to understand is that it's not just measuring from the lowest point of the ground to the highest point of the roof, which is essentially, that's what it is in SLRD, more or less. And there's a determination on where you actually average the ground levels, but that's more or less what we're doing in SLRD, which is not what we're doing in RMOW. So when you do mention that 7.6 meter height limit, it is a little bit, it's kind of skewing the conversation. I think it's just not comparable. It's a completely different thing.
Thank you. So we can have a look at the height. And afterwards we'll talk
Okay.
about that internally.
I'm experiencing that right now. I have some plans, which is about 30–50% done already. And if you lowered it to 11 meters to 10 meter mark, that's it. We have to start all over again and forget the 3 stories. I'm down to 2.
So it sounds to me like in Wedgwoods, the goal in many designs is to have a 3-story house as opposed to 2.
The projects that I've designed there so far, they're all 2 stories with a basement level, which is mostly below grade, but it's at a walkout level at the rear or one side or whatever it is. So we're building into the topography. So we're not ending up with overall a 3-story building. However, my first approved project there on the rear of it, it is a 3-story building. On the front, it drops from 1 story to 2 stories, and it kind of steps down around the slope. And that technically that building easily complies with a 10 meter height limitation. But the only way it does that is because the front of the building, the average ground level and all the points that we took around the front there are so much higher. So it would be impossible to build a 3-story building as Part 9 of the building code allows on a flat lot. Using these modern assemblies, you can do it if you drop the ceiling heights to 8 feet and then you put bulkheads for the ducting. But like we don't want it. No one wants 8-foot ceilings now. Modern designs have 9-foot ceilings. Maybe we have 8-foot bulkheads limited to the sides of rooms, but no one wants 8-foot ceilings, not even in bathrooms. So, okay, so that's general building height. I guess I'm just going to raise a point on the same thing for carriage homes? What's the analysis, the background? What are the reasons why 7 meters is chosen as a maximum height for a carriage house? Because essentially, in Wedgwoods, where carriage houses are allowed, the carriage house is the same 2-story building as the principal residence. I mean, it can have an upper floor with a dwelling unit, and it can be on top of a garage. So there's no difference between the design of the carriage home, essentially, to the design of part of the principal residence that could easily have a garage with a suite on top or living space on top. So why would there be a different building height regulation for principal dwelling versus carriage house?
So you can't achieve a garage with a unit on top in 7 meters, is that what you're saying?
I have one designed right now that's in progress. I mean, we're pretty much ready to submit permits for it. The calculation on that building is, and I pushed it 3 feet into the ground. It's 7.6 meters. So it has a simple sloped shed roof from side to side. So if we start talking about peaked gable roofs, like 12 pitches, they're just not going to comply. So essentially what's going to happen here is that people will design to whatever the regulation is, but we're going to end up with a lot of flat roofs, which means less design variation through the neighborhood, a lot of low ceiling heights. And when we're coming back to affordability, TJI joists are more expensive than truss joists, parallel core truss joists. So we're really trying to design to budgets. I mean, the cost of construction is so expensive right now. It's prohibitive. People are canceling projects because we can't get buildings down to budget. And I would say that we have to be very, very careful with these height limitations because it can increase costs. It can increase building costs. The simpler we can make these floors and roofs, the cheaper the building is.
So I think that, you know, the height was sort of purposely kept low because the carriage houses are meant to be, they're meant to look like tiny carriage houses. They're not meant to look like a big single family dwelling next to another one. Like the whole idea of it was that it was a smaller building on the site.
Whose idea?
The concept for Wedgwoods, right? When those came in.
Which is where? Is this part of the development permit with?
Yeah, when Wedgwoods was first being developed, there was an idea that there would be the main house and then there would be a smaller carriage house, right? And the carriage houses weren't meant to blow up into these structures that just look like single family homes or as big as single family homes. They're meant to be smaller.
And that's, sorry, I was just gonna jump in there. That's why that 200 square meter maximum gross floor area exists too, right? That's all part of, you know, kind of keeping that to a smaller unit. And I did want to just mention a couple things. One with the single family dwellings in Wedgwoods. We've only seen I've got up the spreadsheet here. We've only seen 2 building permits that are actually right at the 11-meter height out of the 61 permits. This goes back to 2009, so I'm not sure if it's inclusive of all building permits in Wedgwoods, but there's 61 permits here. And then we've only seen 3 carriage homes that are over the 7 meters. So I wanted to also just provide that kind of context. And also note that we have looked at other local governments as well. Obviously, we want to consider, you know, the unique context of Area C and Wedgwoods, and we understand there's, you know, topography concerns as well. But yeah, we looked at Whistler. Whistler has the same height restriction for auxiliary dwelling units or accessory buildings that have an auxiliary dwelling unit, so a carriage house. Theirs is also restricted to 7 meters. Squamish restricts theirs to 6.7 meters. So we're not just coming up with these numbers, you know, out of thin air. We are doing the research and we're looking, you know, not only at other local governments, but we're also looking at our own permits to see, you know, what we think is reasonable. We're always expecting to still have some variance applications. We're never going to be able to kind of, you know, make it so that we never nobody ever needs to amend these things, but we're kind of looking at what the average is.
Brenda, you just read that Squamish is 6.7 meters, I think, is that what you said? But it's 7.6 meters. And again, the height calculation methodology is different.
So
So
for carriage house or for an SFD?
that's for a carriage house. So
Or, yeah, I just read it 6.7 meters for if it has an auxiliary dwelling unit in it.
So, yeah, okay, so I don't know if that's current or changed, but I had a carriage house approved for building permit. It's constructed building in Squamish. The height limitation was 7.6 meters, but again, determining where that 7.6 meters is measured from is completely different to SLRD. So that 7.6 meter carriage home in Squamish could have, for that design that I had right at the maximum, and it was not the step code compliant building. So it was using just standard framing, no additional insulation on the roof deck, low ceiling height. So the minimum ceiling height was 8 feet to get it to comply. Wasn't an overheight garage. It had a 7-foot high garage door on it, and I could only just get it to comply. And it's because the end of the lot sloped away slightly, and it moved the line that we have to measure that 7.6 meters down. So if that same building was in Wedgwoods, then it would have been a completely different scenario because of the average height calculation difference between the methodology in Squamish, Whistler, and SLRD. So I think I want to leave the building height questions on, I mean, from my point of view there, but I do want to finish on that topic by suggesting or questioning the methodology in determining these numbers, because I'm hearing that you've compared to other municipalities, but how do you know they have it right? I mean, when were these bylaws created? What was their methodology? And it sounds like you're relying too heavily on, well, that's what they're doing. I think you've got a great opportunity here to put more work into this and to do more research and to come up with better numbers that are more appropriate based on what we want to build now, moving towards energy efficiency and affordability. So I think you can do better on the building height, and it's based on the research and the methodology of the research and the data set that you're using. It's just not comprehensive enough. So, okay, moving on.
Can I just jump in with one question from an online participant that's related? I would also like to raise concerns with the 7-meter height restrictions on carriage houses. A lot of my neighbors in Wedgwoods are outdoor enthusiasts. I was told by my realtor that I would be able to build a taller garage to store camper sleds, etc., with the ADU, auxiliary dwelling unit, carriage home on top, and that's what attracted me to build in the area. That's just related to the current conversation.
And again, if this person does, have a specific need to have a higher RV or something parked inside their garage, they can apply for a variance, and we would look at it on a site-specific basis, and the neighbors would be able to weigh in as to whether they thought that was okay or if it was going to affect their view, this kind of thing. That's why we have the variance process.
I think that process is acceptable and fine if there's a reasonable height limit set in the first place. So why would you want to create a situation where every single project you're going to be doing paperwork on variances, which delay projects and cost money?
But we've only had 2
so far. But
Yeah,
if you-
but
if
that's
you
like a
drop-
pretty small percentage of the 61 houses, like that's,
But, okay, so-
and that's sort of an acceptable amount of variances.
But again, we're coming back to the data set that you guys are basing all these opinions on.
Well, we can only do what we can do. And with our.
We're looking at our
bylaws,
own permits though, right? Like we're looking at all of the building permits that we've had in Wedgwoods.
But like I said before, the topography at the base, the valley floor of Wedgwoods down near the river is completely different to up on the slope.
Yeah, it's more
So-
challenging.
It can be, yeah.
Whereas now we're getting into phases 5 and 6, where it actually plateaus and flattens out and makes it quite a bit easier to achieve those heights.
Right, so I think it would be appropriate to determine, well, how does the 7-meter height limit for a carriage house look on a flat lot versus down on the valley floor? And we need some correlation between the slope of these lots that had buildings approved at certain heights. I mean, it has to be a metric. You can't just throw a blanket over the whole of Wedgwoods and Area C. I mean, we're not just talking about areas. We're not just talking about Wedgwoods here. We're talking about the entirety of Area C. So we're talking about from dead flat floodplain to mountainside. We're talking everything in between. So to just come up with a number of 7 meters is completely
Like Brenda said, we did do our research, and with our bylaw regulations, it's like we don't build the church for Easter Sunday, right? We come up with a reasonable number that most people could achieve for the typical use. And we expect that, yes, in certain circumstances, there will be people that are going to have a need to go higher, or they're going to have a need to go wider. And so that's why we have a variance process. So in those circumstances, and it's cheap, it's not super expensive.
So at the
Look
moment,
at the cost, and we can usually get variances done pretty quickly.
we need to bring this back to context. At the moment, the height limitation for a carriage house in Wedgwoods is 11 meters. So we've been designing to, even if that is not true, based on what Brenda is saying, that the current height regulation in the current zoning bylaw apparently doesn't apply to any building. So at the moment, even though we've been designing to 11 meters for every building in Wedgwoods, I'm speaking for myself here, but I know other designers and architects have too. But technically, there is no building height limit right now. So what you're talking about essentially is going from no limit on building height, worst case scenario, 11 meters, down to 7 meters. So this is not like a minor change to people's expectations as to what they can and can't build in Wedgwoods.
That's partly why we're doing a housekeeping amendment, because we realize, hey, there's no height regulations. So we're trying to come up with regulations that make sense within the SLRD that most people will be able to achieve.
Okay, well, this kind of speaks to one of my questions. What is the definition of a housekeeping amendment, and how is it different from a new height regulation bylaw?
A housekeeping amendment is just a bylaw that we do. It's not a full-blown bylaw, but it's to clean things up. That's why we call it housekeeping.
So is reducing the building height from unlimited to 7 meters a minor housekeeping amendment? I mean, where's the?
We're trying to fix the bylaw, basically.
Okay.
So we're cleaning it up, and we're putting some regulations where they don't exist.
Okay.
In a way that is
Okay.
workable.
Do planning staff have the authority or power to override or contradict a current bylaw with their opinions or interpretations, whatever you want to call them? Is that an authority and power that planning staff actually?
Bylaw is a bylaw, so we follow the words of our bylaw. So unless there is some delegated authority.
Okay, so I'm just trying to get to the point of understanding if an owner calls in the design process and asks planning staff what the bylaw says, and planning staff give that inquiry an answer that doesn't match what the words in the bylaw say, I mean, what's the situation then? Is it the bylaw that has the final say, or is it?
I would have to know exactly what you're talking about. I mean, the bylaw has the final say. There are some things that we've done though, like for example, carriage houses, crawl spaces. There isn't an exemption, and we've granted exemptions as a matter of operating to help people out. So we don't include space under, is it 4 feet? Marlene will know, I think it's 4 feet. So we've excluded those. And it helps people out. It's not written in the bylaw. It's something we've done as a courtesy over the years.
Crawl space.
Crawl space.
I believe it is written into the current bylaw as an exemption for buildings. GFA does not include crawl space.
Marlene can speak to that. Anyway.
No, so crawl spaces up to 1.5 meters in height, which are defined as the height between the floor and grade and the ceiling or the floor just above are excluded from GFA currently. It's written in the bylaw.
It's written for principal buildings, but what we're doing is making it clear that it applies for all buildings. So that's why we've included it for accessory buildings, carriage houses, because we're separating out all of those inclusions and exclusions.
Right. Okay, so the current, so the amendment by law 1742 under carriage houses. Sorry, gross floor area for carriage houses. Under inclusions. I noticed on your presentation there, Brenda, that you had added garage as an inclusion. But the current written bylaw here does not include garage in that section. It doesn't list it as garage. So is this something that's being added for the next iteration that will be tabled?
So you're looking at the bylaw that was last presented to the board, is that right?
Exactly, for the December 14th meeting. So has that already been revised?
Yeah, so that was something that we kind of missed in that iteration of the bylaw. The intent is that carports and garage space are fully included for carriage houses.
Okay.
Anybody else have any other questions?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think we'll take one more.
Can we
Question.
take one? I have someone with their hand up. They've had their hand up for quite a while. Can we go to this person before we move on? I don't know if this is related to the topics we just discussed or if this is another question, but Ed, I think I'm allowing you to speak, so please go ahead with your question.
Hi, Brenda. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to answer your chat, but my chat was disabled, so I couldn't answer you. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, that's why I actually emailed you separately. So sorry about that. I just couldn't answer you because it's, you know, it's muted. So anyways, I do have my comments and question is related to what the discussion is. So I'm a structural engineer that's been operating in the Sea to Sky corridor for the last 25 years. We actually have a truss manufacturer for 8 years in Squamish. So my comment is related to what Aaron is saying about the thickness of the roof. I know that the Squamish bylaw of height for carriage house is 7.6 meters. That's correct. But the Squamish snow load is well, the SLRD area C snow load is 4 to 5 times higher than Squamish. So we do need a thicker structure for the roof, especially to allow for the heights. Although I know that you only have a few applications that's 11 meters, but I'm sure there's a lot of them that would be 9 or 10, because if we need a sloped roof to carry the snow, it's going to be much thicker than they would be in Squamish. So I just want to make that comment, and also related to the floor joists, even between the floors, the values for wood has gone down significantly over time. There's no more old growth floor joists anymore. The second and third and fourth growth, they're softer. So we do need thicker floor joists now compared to previous houses. So we are approaching 14-inch, even 16-inch thick floors in the structure. So just to back what Aaron's saying, we do need a higher building allowance because each floor and the roof has to be thicker than they are in Squamish because of the loading. So I just want to add that in as a technical comment. So.
Okay, thank you for that. That's good to know.
Brenda, just quickly back to this is kind of more of a comment than a question, but just quickly back to the excludable gross floor area for carriage houses again. I don't think that you are listing basement. Maybe that was my previous comment. Sorry. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I was talking about the garage before, that you've added the garage now, but I don't think the bylaw that was presented to council on December 14th, I could be wrong. Did it list basement? under
No.
included for carriage house or not? Because this is
No.
some of this, I know that there's a lot of gray area around this and there has been a lot of gray area around this in time gone by, but so is the intent to not allow a basement for a carriage house?
No, I think that is a good point that we don't list it. I don't think, I don't, maybe somebody else can speak to this, but I don't think basements are super common in carriage houses. So I think it's just something that we didn't think we would really need to list. But it would be included as kind of common, the common utility occupied portions of the building under that kind of first bullet there. I don't know if anyone knows.
So then considering that basements are currently excluded from buildings because there is no differentiation right now between principal, carriage or auxiliary. So technically right now, under the current zoning bylaw, basements are excludable for any building. That's what's written in the code.
No, because that regulation is specific to principal buildings. A carriage house has its own regulations under the CD1 zone, specifically that maximum size of 200 square meters. So under that regulation, it actually includes everything because there's no exclusions specifically stated for carriage houses. So we're actually providing some exclusions that weren't there previously.
I don't know if that's completely correct though, Brenda, because the current general regulations allow a basement to be excluded from a building. There is no differentiation in.
Yeah,
the-
I understand it's kind of unclear in the current bylaw, but that's not the intent. The intent is for carriage houses to be the
Going back
maximum
to-
size of 200 square meters.
Going back to what Kim confirmed before is that the bylaw overrides opinion.
It's
or
not
interpret-
opinion, it's up to us as planners to interpret that bylaw. So that's how we've always interpreted that bylaw. So, before we kind of had this confusion around it, that's how we interpreted it. Now that we understand there's kind of some areas that can be clarified, that's why we're bringing forward these amendments.
Okay, so back to my previous question that Brenda answered, Kim answered. Kim said that the written bylaw overrides any other interpretation by planning staff. So which is it? Because now you're saying that planning staff are overriding what the bylaw says currently.
I think, Aaron, we're getting away from focusing on these particular amendments. So can you keep your comments, please, to the amendments at hand? I don't want to argue about the past and how things were interpreted and
Sure,
bylaw.
okay,
Let's
so-
focus on what we're proposing now, which is
Okay.
really meant to create
Okay.
improvements
All right, so-
and make things simpler so that we're not having to have these discussions about what the bylaw actually says and doesn't say.
Well, I think it's important to illustrate that there are some significant reductions in significant new inclusions of how to calculate gross floor area in this amendment bylaw. So speaking about this amendment bylaw, so basements are being added to carriage homes, garages are being added to carriage homes as non-excludable gross floor area. That's a huge significant change. So I think it's important to establish that designs have been in process or approved for Wedgwoods, for carriage homes, and that this new zoning bylaw will significantly impact what can and can't be done, particularly for carriage homes, because there is no intent to go forward with an exclusion for a garage floor area or a basement for a carriage house in Wedgwoods. So at the moment, we're using the current bylaw and it says that we can exclude basement areas up to 90 square meters and garages from buildings. That's what it says.
And I think that that's your interpretation, and we've had a lot of discussion about your particular case offline, and I think it's best for this public information meeting. We should keep your particular case out of it. We can talk about that offline.
I don't think we have a particular case though.
We've had discussions between yourselves and yourself and our department about what you're talking about.
No,
So I
submitted
think that's
some
something that,
correspondence, but I don't have a particular, are you referring to a particular application? I don't have a particular. I don't have a current
we've been talking about this particular piece, and I think it would probably be good for those in the room that we move on from this discussion about the basements and the carriage houses. And we can talk about that. We realize that you have a concern there.
Sure.
We do have a question, comment. This is related back to the temporary housing for farm workers. I'd like to return to the question regarding using RVs as temporary housing for farm workers, the same way that RVs can be used while someone is building a home, and why those both can't be exceptions to the rules. If the issue is with temporary farm worker housing not meeting health and safety guidelines for occupants, why are RVs allowed for a homeowner building a home? It seems like this is specifically discriminating against farm workers and farmers. If the concern is that RVs will not be removed once the farm workers are not living in them, then create enforcement around that piece instead. If the concern is around health and safety for occupants, then homeowners should not be allowed to live temporarily in RVs either.
I can take that. Poop. Where does the poop go? Homeowners living in RVs usually either have a municipal connection to service their own sewer while they're building, or they have septic systems as is part of the British Columbia Wastewater Management Act. They have to have somewhere for their wastewater to go. Septic design and approval is part of the building process. So as a building permit applicant and someone with a building permit, that's why we allow RVs as temporary housing while their principal dwellings are being built. RVs on farmland for temporary housing, where is that going? We don't know, and we don't know how to monitor that, or we can't just throw it or like,
Well, as if that's what we do,
sorry?
as if that's what we're doing.
No, but not
It's
you.
just an insult. Like, it's just ridiculous. We're organic farms, most of us, but,
But you have a septic system, correct?
well, we have some sort of system. We have porta potties that are serviced weekly by GFL.
Yeah.
Lots of us have those. We have outhouses that are perfectly acceptable at parks and campgrounds. We have toilets in buildings. We all use the toilet. We don't just go willy-nilly, like we're aware of the need to handle septic. And the point is, for this question, is that there's a building permit attached to the RV that goes with the house build. So that's part of the building permit. So it's not really comparable. I get that. No, but that's a clear differentiation. But I mean, obviously it's something that you would want to have some surety of. That's fine. There's no allowance for RVs as temporary farm worker housing, so there's no basis for any of it.
No, I'm trying to drive the point home a bit because it's like.
But I think the point that I'm trying to drive home, I think a lot of us are trying to drive home, is that the SLRD does not need to be quite so on it with the building permits. We can take care of these things. We are not children. We have market competition to keep us up to date. It's not a question of how high the building is or how deep the basement or whatever. Those are important things that you need to stay on top of. But we are running businesses here. We have public on our farm all the time. 3,000 people come to our farm every year for Soul Food Cycle Sunday on one day over the entire farm, looking at everything. Would we get away with anything? No, we would not get away with anything. Like, we're selling food to people who are eating it. And there are lots of regulations. There are lots of regulations in the ALC and federally about if we're foreign workers, then the federal thing. If they're just so-and-so from Oliver, then we have the ALC to deal with. And that questionnaire from the BC Ag Council is very extensive. And it has to be filled out by a building inspector. I can't just go check it off. Like it's a proper form. I can't even ask for the form.
Never seen it before.
It's the BCAC, blah, 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 on the ALC, the non-adhering farm use thing. Sorry, not a planner, don't have the right name. But it's not, if we're going through the ALC to get permission to house temporary workers, this form from the BC Agriculture Council needs to be filled out, not by us, by the inspector.
Their inspector.
I don't think it says their inspector. I think it says a professional. Like, I'm assuming it would be you in this. Okay, I don't know who it is. Then.
I haven't heard of that either. I don't see that in their non-adhering residential use, when like the guidelines they have. I don't see
What's
anything.
your guideline? What's your thing? The guidelines for the provision of seasonal housing for migrant farm workers in BC. What's that? I think that's what I'm talking about.
Okay, maybe it's a separate guideline, but they don't specifically mention that in the policy related to temporary farm worker housing.
I think it goes to the BC. I think it's a service provided by the BC Ag Council, BCAC.
But so that's specifically related to foreign workers, right?
No, and the ALC considers all workers, all temporary workers under the same way.
Okay.
Yeah, if we apply to the ALC to provide for housing, this is the path we go down. There's quite an extensive. Yeah, there's quite an extensive thing. There's a size per worker, like square footage. There's how many people can share a kitchen, how many people can share bathroom facilities, all that sort of thing is in there. And they are the experts. Like, that's their whole focus is agriculture. So they understand I mean, I think somebody suggested a cost benefit analysis that still could be done at the ALC level for farms our size. I think it's not easy. I don't think any of us have been through it. I don't know anyone that's been through it. So I don't think it's easy, but we know there have to be plans for septic and water, like that does have to happen, but it's not just farms that have this problem. Like, as Naomi was saying, like, there's lots of problems to look at that are not farm problems, and lots of, like, you can go on there and deal with it. You're perfectly allowed to go onto a property and deal with it. Aren't you?
In some circumstances, yes, but I also need, as a regional district, we rely on the public to help me find these things.
Well, so what are we gonna have everybody running around like informing?
If
I
there's
don't know, I
something
feel
you
like
don't
I
like,
feel
that's,
like I've taken us off.
no,
Please,
this
here.
is how we operate, and this is how our modus operandi, like, we do rely on the public to register complaints, to
Yeah.
level the playing field. Like, this is entirely how it operates. We're, as a small organization, we don't have budgets to have people going around patrolling.
We would have complaints, I think, from workers. I would think, from workers if they're in a messy situation, especially a foreign worker, as Naomi said.
That's fog in there.
There's a ton of fog out here. I'm not sure what's going on.
I thought it was my glasses.
Oh, no, it's not, it's smoke.
And that's what that ringing was a fire alarm.
You know what it is,
I think it's fire.
the guys downstairs they've got their smoke machine.
Okay.
I feel like there's something wrong with my.
Full of, like, Halloween fog.
I think I just.
Yeah, I might wanna go down, I'll go down.
You
and
know what
tell
those guys need is bylaw. A smoker's bylaw.
them. So what they're doing.
Sorry
is
about
they're-
that, ladies.
Well, at least it's not my glasses.
So maybe we can sort of wrap up this portion of the input process, and maybe if we could hear any final input on
Hey,
the.
guys,
I just had one.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Very short question.
any final input on the ag related amendments?
I think our final message would be, please understand that we're,
I'm gonna go down and just tell them they might wanna. Eventually,
Just do a bit more work and look to some of the like Anna's talking about, like,
well, I think it's more than
Look
that,
at-
because it's in the it's existing in the bylaw, or issues are enshrined in bylaw. So we're in a pickle.
Well, you can apply to the ALC. There's a path. And see if you get approved by them.
But then it's coming to you and then
It becomes I guess it's really a difference. In our principles, right? So like, I understand fully, you guys have cost issues. Yeah, like, I understand the food security issues. I understand the housing issues, absolutely. Thank you. And then we have our issues, which are safety, is the roof gonna fall down? Where does the sewage go? Where does the water come from? Fire risk, all of these sorts of things. And unfortunately, the two aren't necessarily compatible, and I don't know how we marry them. And I think that's an issue that I guess we need to talk about internally to see if there's anything creative that can be done. It's a challenge, right? And I know you don't want to see Phil on farmland, and there's an expense to bring on Phil to raise these things to FCL and all of this stuff. And it's just tough to marry these ones together. And I guess it's something we'll have to talk about, but I do understand fully, where you guys are coming from. I mean, we all know that food is going up, the costs are outrageous, right? And I just can't imagine how you guys even do it,
Well, it's a viable business, like
Right.
we can make some money, like we're not
Yeah.
hand to mouth or anything like that.
But it's still a struggle, and you have all these issues with finding staff.
Well, we just can't afford to do it to this level. So I think a signal to us that you recognize that we're in a pickle and that you're interested in working on it would be to leave out of this amendment anything to do with, like, just don't even.
Well, the
go
thing is,
there.
it's already there.
But the amendment isn't there. You could remove wording
So that-
in the. proposed
That's the
amendment.
thing though, Anna, if we don't make this amendment, there's a full SLRD application that's required. Because that's
Well,
what's
not the good
existing.
things. We don't want you to remove the good things from the proposal. Don't get me wrong.
So either way, we would have to make some kind of amendment. So I think that's kind of what Kim's trying to get at. Like, if we
Yeah.
don't make this change, it's gonna be an SLRD application and an ALC application. So it's actually gonna be way more stringent.
You get double the red tape.
But right now, nobody's doing the red tape. So what's the difference?
Well, we have this application right now.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, yeah.
I have one final question, but it's a quick one.
Do you promise?
For Brenda. Okay, so I think rooftop patio is potentially a new term that you're introducing as something that is excluded from gross floor area, but do you have a current definition for rooftop patio?
I don't think we have a definition. I think we thought it was pretty self-explanatory, but maybe that's something we need to look at. The reason we're adding that is this is kind of a new thing that we're seeing, and we didn't really know how to deal with rooftop patio, so.
What's your current version of rooftop patio? When you hear that term, what do you think is happening?
Thank you.
I don't know if I have like a specific definition. To me, it's pretty self-explanatory, but honestly, this came from our building department, who are seeing these types of structures with rooftop patios. So I'm not sure, Arlene, if you can speak to that more. I don't know if you.
Erin, a lot of times we just defer to the dictionary. So a rooftop patio is a patio on a rooftop.
Okay, because so I'm asking the question because so a roof would be any surface that would drain water and protect an area underneath.
The roof,
Could be one definition. A roof doesn't necessarily need to be enclosed underneath. So it could be a roof over above a below grade patio, an on grade patio. So you could have a second story balcony that is a rooftop patio. So it doesn't, at the moment, without a proper definition, it could be a rooftop on the very top of the building, but it could also be a rooftop that's not at the top of the building. So
fair enough.
I'm trying to understand the intent.
I think we imagine it being using a flat roof to have a patio at the top of the house. And if that needs clarification, we'll have a look at that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's only been a few cases where we've seen this, so I don't think we thought that it really needed like its own definition, but if that's the case, then yeah, we didn't know that it was gonna be kind of a murky thing.
Well, I guess it could be interchanged with the term deck, possibly porch, veranda, or balcony, and without definitions for each one of those words, then it could be interchanged. So you've got one situation where an unenclosed balcony or veranda, up to 20% of the GFA, allowable GFA of the building is excluded from the gross floor area. A rooftop patio is also excluded, but there could be a situation where rooftop patio is also used, but it's not any one of those other things that fall under that maximum 20%. So,
The eyes of the building code.
okay.
But I think the building code is one thing, but we will look at the bylaw. Thank you for coming up with that. That's a good comment.
We do have another comment here from an online participant, so I'll just make sure that we don't lose this one. A lot of us bought into the lots in brackets Wedgewoods, reading the bylaws as allowing basements, garages, carports in auxiliary cottage house buildings. Regardless of original intent, I'm opposed to those areas not being excluded. It's so limiting. We have a huge slope on our lot and imagined having storage under our carriage house. I understand it's up to planners to interpret the bylaws, but as Aaron says, the bylaws are to be interpreted literally as they could be legally interpreted. We want to create improvements that significantly limit the overall value of our properties. Aaron's comments are not unique to him at all. Everyone I speak to in our community read them this way when they purchase. There's major opposition here to this clarification. And at the moment, that's our last comment question from our online participants.
Thanks, Claire. Well, I think with that, I think we've exhausted all the questions. We've heard a lot of good input. I think this meeting's been very productive, and I thank you, Aaron, for sticking around to the very end and for compiling a pretty good list of input for us. And thanks to the online people for providing input. So we'll take this away, and I think there are definitely a few points that we'll go away and look at and try and see if we can make some improvements to the bylaw before we present it to a public hearing. So thanks. We'll close the meeting now.